Hello and welcome to Cardinal Perspectives, an in-depth conversation with alumni, students, faculty, and the extended community of Catholic University. Today we're featuring a conversation with Sir James MacMillan, a preeminent Scottish composer, and Dennis Strach, Director of Diocesan Engagement at Catholic University. Sir MacMillan has become a leading voice in classical music, renowned for his deeply expressive compositions that intertwine his Scottish heritage, Catholic faith, and a profound sense of social conscience. His works, such as the Confession of Isabel Gaudy and the widely performed Veni Veni Emmanuel, have garnered international acclaim and have been featured by major orchestras worldwide, including the London Symphony Orchestra and the New York Philharmonic. MacMillan has also composed a piece for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, Who Shall Separate Us, and one for Pope Benedict XVI's apostolic visit to Great Britain in 2010. Toda Pulchra Es, which was commissioned for the American Guild of Organists National Convention and premiered next to our campus at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. Beyond his compositions, Sir James is a passionate advocate for sacred music and its role in nurturing full, conscious, and active participation in the Eucharist. This led to his involvement in the Welcoming Children in Worship Project, a liturgical formation initiative at Catholic University. In this episode, Sir MacMillan sits down with Dennis Strach to talk about the intersection of faith and art in sacred music, his journey as a composer, and much more. We hope you enjoy.
Greetings from Washington, D.C. and the Catholic University of America, the National University of the Catholic Church in the United States. My name is Dennis Strach, and I serve as the university's Director of Diocesan Engagement, and I'm joined today by Sir James MacMillan, internationally renowned Scottish composer and conductor of classical and sacred music, and founder of the Cumnock Tryst Music Festival. Those within the music world will no doubt be familiar with his extensive work, but even for our listeners who may not be as familiar with orchestral or choral music, one might highlight James MacMillan's Who Shall Separate Us, a piece that he composed for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, or perhaps his mass setting, written for Pope Benedict XVI apostolic visit to Great Britain in 2010, or even Toda Pulchra Es, which was commissioned for the American Guild of Organists National Convention and premiered here on our campus at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. He's an incredibly talented, thoughtful, and humble man, and we're blessed to have him with us at Catholic University for this conversation. Sir James MacMillan, welcome back to campus.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here again.
You're a very busy man. I know you just came from Minnesota for a 2-week engagement with Minnesota Orchestra and Vocal Essence, a world-famous choral organization. And now this week you are here on campus for a number of events with our community as part of the pastoral initiative Welcoming Children in Worship, which is made possible by a Lilly grant. So your time with us involves a number of events with our students and our faculty, Dr. Peter Cadelli, who heads our sacred music program, and Dr. Jem Sullivan, Associate Professor of Catechetics, who leads the Welcoming Children in Worship initiative. Maybe let's just start with your time here thus far. I know you're in the middle of your week, but maybe give a sense to our audience what you've done thus far and what's around the corner. I know you have a big day today and a big night this evening.
Yes, well, most of the work so far has been a series of interviews with Father Philip Ganier, who's a Jesuit, an alumna of this university, and now teaches at Boston College in Boston. And so the conversation has revolved around the importance of music, not just the importance of music to society, but the importance of music to the church, and the possibility of music being engaged as a way of bringing young children to the faith and involving them more in liturgy and in considerations of the beautiful, not just in the world of the church, but in life in general. There's also been rehearsals already for the little event tonight. Peter Cadelli is interviewing me in Heritage Hall, and the chamber choir here for the university is singing some of my music at that.
I'm excited to have you here, and I know President Kilpatrick will be with us tonight at that event. I want to start, though, from the beginning of your story and thinking about, we were talking about this a little before we hit record, sort of how did this all happen kind of a thing. the roots of your love for music and for composing. And I also want to give our audience a sense of these two worlds that kind of come together in a complex way. They sort of collide in your vocation, and I'm speaking of the worlds of music and faith. You grow up in Scotland, near Glasgow, and you learn, like many of us in music school, by way of a plastic recorder, and your grandfather is a big influence in your exploration of music, gives you a cornet, you explore there a little bit, along with piano, singing. But you know you want to be a composer at a young age. And at 9 years old, you write a small piece for your mom on the piano. At this early age, what is it about composing that really keeps you focused and draws you in? Because you're a kid still, you're a child still. So what is it about composing that really draws you?
It's a very good question, because I did realise that I wanted to be a composer from the first few days, and although I didn't know what that meant. So how did I know about composing? How did I know about composers? It was through very early discussions with the two people that you've mentioned, my grandfather and my mother, who talked to me about some of the great composers of the past. They loved music in their different ways. You know, my grandfather, like many men in Scotland, was a coal miner, but he played in colliery bands, played an instrument called the euphonium. The British brass band tradition was very strong in industrial areas and still is. So he was able to introduce me to instruments like the cornet he bought for me and took me to my first band practices. But he showed me music that he would sing as a singer in his local church choir. And he was fascinated by music. I think because men like that spent 50 years, in his case, under the ground, hacking away at coal, they sought out beauty any way they could, and for him it was through music. And he had introduced my mother to music. She wasn't as interested in it as I was, but she did play the piano as a teenager, and therefore the house was full of her old piano music, and I started finding it. Who is Beethoven? Might have been one of the first questions I asked at that age. I remember all this music being around, so I was introduced to the concept of people composing music, and the instinct was with me. You know, within days of playing, I realised I wanted to write music or create my own music in some way. I didn't know what that meant then, but I've been trying to work it all out ever since.
And so in your experience now as a composer, looking back maybe, and having a better understanding of what that means, you shared that the music for you kind of needs to be dealt with. In other words, it's sort of like an experience from outside of you. And this outside inspiration, whether that's the Holy Spirit or however one might kind of name that, is interacting with your particular person and your experiences and your thoughts, your feelings, your struggles, and your heart. When did you first begin to understand this vocation of composing music as something that actually involves this other being, if you will, something divine and something outside of you?
Well, I think it might have been a gradual thing, and I'm certainly not the first or only artist who talks about external motivation, external inspiration, and the concept that inspiration is a spiritual thing is there deep in our culture. And I very quickly found out what some of these great composers of the past had to say about it. And if you read Beethoven's writings on his relationship with the divine, you realise that here was a man, probably the most famous composer there has ever been, you could say, who had a deep relationship with God and saw his role as a composer as a mission. It was actually a word he used about his role as a mission, certainly a vocation. And he saw his role as a symphonist, for example, so not necessarily just in the area of sacred music, of which he did write quite significantly, but he wrote the 9 great symphonies, and he regarded that as part of a sacred mission. Now, the interesting thing about Beethoven is that subsequently a lot of musicologists have tried to write out the religious dimension of his life, and they do that with a lot of composers and artists. It's either they don't want to talk about it or they don't notice it. But if you probe deeply enough and actually read what Beethoven said about his relationship with God and music's relationship with the divine, you realise that Beethoven, one of the great composers, saw an umbilical link between God and music. He regarded himself as the vessel through which God spoke. And if Beethoven thinks along those terms, then maybe the rest of us might think something similar, could think something similar. Although society has changed, history has changed the world, and sometimes the arts don't really have the same connection with the numinous as they did in Beethoven's time. Although with music, it's impossible to divorce music from a sense of the spiritual. People who love music say that music is the most spiritual of the arts, and a lot of those people who love music are not religiously inclined at all, but they're recognizing a truth about the nature of the art form.
And I wanted to ask you about that. It seems like your music is a perfect venue for reaching even those audiences that may not be religious at all, atheists or agnostics. You're often in venues, secular venues, where one of your audiences is enjoying a sacred text or a piece of Gregorian chant that has been set, and as you mentioned, you're still approached by people who might consider themselves not to be religious or part of an organized religion, agnostic, atheist, whatever you might say, and talk about your music as a spiritual experience or something that opens them up to something beyond themselves. Were you aware of that power again, or that gift early on in your career? Or is that something that maybe came through by way of was it simply in reading those stories of those early composers and being aware of that gift, or did you become aware of it more by way of that audience feedback as your career
all of those things.
All the above.
It's been a gradual evolution of, I wouldn't say just thinking, it is thinking and reading, but of learning about what it means to be a composer, learning about music's place in the world and in society, and the necessity for listeners to sacrifice something of themselves to the power of music. So I think all that is embedded in the initial burst of joy that a young musician has in discovering music for the first time, but you're never quite aware of the fullness of the story until the message is fleshed out through life and through experience and through reading.
And for I'm sure Dr. Sullivan and many folks in the catechetical world, like your work is evangelical in nature, in the sense that you do create a sacred space for people with different political leanings, different religious experiences, and kind of create a space of communion in the music that you write and in the experience of listening to that music. And in catechetical spaces, we're often talking about the difference between knowing Jesus and encountering and experiencing him. And so in your work, it seems that you invite your listeners to experience music on their own terms, which requires a sort of, as you mentioned, like a letting go and a spirit of openness to be changed by what they hear. Even for these secular venues or audiences, it seems you're evangelizing the culture, or you have an opportunity to do that by way of the pieces you compose. When you speak about your own experience as a composer, you speak about a hunger or a thirst that needs to be satisfied. You talk about like an urgency with which a musical thought or a specific text needs to be shared. How do you perceive the role of the university in helping students tap into those qualities? Are those qualities that can be taught or formed? I mean, there's a lot of parallels with preaching and evangelization, and that urgency of the message that needs to be shared. And there's something like that in the way you talk about composing. But when it comes to the university's role, is that something that's innate? Is that something that's taught or formed within a student?
Well, it's an interesting question, the relationship that educators, either in universities or colleges or conservatoires, have with imaginative students who may want to be composers. The big question is, can composition be taught? And the one that haunts me is, how do you teach composition? I don't know. I have been taught composition, apparently, and certainly I regard some of my teachers as great mentors. I don't know what they did to make me want to continue, but they did something, and now I'm being asked to do the same in mentoring younger composers, and I don't know how it's done, other than just share experiences of the older artist with the younger artist, and encourage any God-given talent that the younger artist might have. But there is a limitation on what an educator can do for a composer, because a composer is either born a composer or not. And in a sense, you're given something regardless of background or education. And therefore the educator, the parent, the church, the community has to encourage that God-given gift to develop and to grow and to thrive in any way they can. So a teacher is in that position. A university is in that position with an artist to encourage something that may be there or may not be there, and try their best to nurture it and bring it forth.
The university has announced just recently a new Masters in Sacred Music program, which will begin this fall, 2025. And certainly students within a sacred music program, like the one here at Catholic University, will have some very unique opportunities, one of which will be to grasp the rich tradition of liturgical music, and in a particular way, Gregorian chant. Now, for, again, our broad audience listening, chant is a specifically church kind of music, something that's unique to the church, and some might say it isn't a very relevant part of their daily lives or the daily lives of musicians. But share with us why a foundational knowledge of chant is so important, not just to the modern sacred musician, but to musicians in any realm. I think that's a really interesting.
Yes, well, chant has an interesting place in our society and church today. I've been intrigued in recent years that the world outside the world of music has discovered chant anew, not for religious reasons, but usually for some kind of aesthetic reason. I noticed maybe 20 years ago, certainly in the UK, perhaps even here too, that a lot of younger people were buying recordings of chant, and chant was beginning to appear more on radio stations, not just classical radio stations, and it was something to do with the desire for relaxation, the desire for reflection. Apparently, not that I know anything about club culture, but my children's generation tell me that when they visited clubs, which was full of all this very, very noisy, deafening music, some would retire to a quiet room, and in many cases in that quiet room, Gregorian chant would be played. And so it's something about the modern culture rediscovered chant, just as the Catholic Church was abandoning it. So there's a lesson to the church there. What is it about chant that appeals to the secular world? What is it in the nature of chant that the secular world finds beautiful, but a certain age demographic in the Catholic Church wanted to abandon it? There's a lesson there to us that we have to rediscover chant ourselves. It was never the intention of the Church in the Second Vatican Council to get rid of chant. It actually holds that chant is a primal musical force in the Church's liturgy, and should be renewed and maybe even adapted. The idea of singing chant in the vernacular languages now is available to us and can be done very well. We can hear Gregorian chant sung in English or French or Spanish. And that's a natural consequence of the Second Vatican Council. Pope Benedict spoke about chant and polyphony as important archetypes for the consideration of even new music in the church, and I kind of agree with that. I see the sense in that there's something about chant, let's begin with that sounds specifically Catholic, as you said. Some people would say that Gregorian chant is the sound of Catholicism. In popular films, past and present, if you hear chant, you know that there's going to be something about the church, good or bad, in the film, and so therefore it's part of the DNA of Catholic life, and should be encouraged one way or another, and to be allowed to fit with the post-conciliar liturgy. There's not one way of doing liturgical music. There's many different ways, of course, but chant should be one of those prime considerations, I think, along with everything else.
And from a music theory standpoint as well, those chants are really the underpinning of our concept of music theory in any sort of realm, right? And that's not just not just sacred music,
exactly.
right?
I mean, chant, Gregorian chant is the music of the first millennium. It's the classical music of the first millennium. It's the music of the church during the first 1,000 years. And then it became the basis of the music of the next millennium because it shaped the development of polyphony and shaped the DNA of a lot of the music of the Renaissance composers, which in turn influenced subsequent generations. And should be alive now in the third millennium.
I want to take a look back at that lens of evangelization once more. You've traveled all over the world. You've met and engaged with hundreds of musicians. I'm curious how you see the church speaking to our current situation and engaging the culture and our modern situation.
In connection with musicians that I meet? Yes, well, I mean, I suppose in some ways people regard me as being unusual in that, part of modern culture. I'm a living composer, or at least I was the last time I checked. I'm writing music for the modern world, and yet I'm very much not just a person of spiritual dimension, but a person of faith that is actually a practicing Catholic, an obedient Catholic. And people regard that as odd. At one time it was not odd. It was the expected thing, and in the past, some of the composers I've mentioned would divide their time between writing for the secular world and writing for the church. In a strange way, I still do that, although most of my work is for the secular world. But I do love the church, and sometimes I write music for the liturgy as well, and I regard that as a very important part of it. So bringing that narrative to the wider world of contemporary music or contemporary classical music, the world of composers and performers of modern music, it's an interesting conversation, an interesting series of conversations to be had. But the first thing I tell the skeptics amongst my fellow music lovers is that I'm not alone. There are loads of composers still alive, and some of the great composers of the 20th century were profoundly religious men and women. And I point to the likes of Stravinsky, who fell in love with the Catholicism of the West when he came from Russia to Europe. He set the Mass, he set the Psalms, he set little prayers. The other great polar opposite in early modernism, Schoenberg, reconverted to a practicing Judaism when he left Germany, and his later music is infused with Jewish theology and spirit. The great American iconoclast John Cage chose to study with Schoenberg. He was a major musical thinker in the 20th century. He saw in Schoenberg a fellow mystic. He found his own path to the sacred through the ideas and indeed the religions of the Far East. So it's not just Christianity that is apparent and vibrant in modern music and culture. It's lots of other religions too, Judaism and so on. There's a whole range of composers who are profoundly religious and specifically Christian who came after Shostakovich. Behind the Iron Curtain, the post-Shostakovich modernists who were, Arvo Pärt is still alive in Estonia. I've been in his company recently. He had to leave Estonia because he took a stance against the state-enforced atheism of the Soviet state by writing religious music, by setting the credo to music and challenging the dogmas of an anti-religious society and politics. The whole of the Eastern experience is full of people like that. Olivier Messiaen was famously Catholic, the French composer, the teacher of Boulez and Stockhausen, so therefore one of the most important figures of the 20th century. His Catholicism wasn't extra to that primal situation. It was the reason he is so important as a composer. And the likes of Olivier Messiaen and Pärt and so on gave me and people like me permission to be openly, not just religious, but openly Catholic in our artistic lives.
I I want to go back to something we spoke to earlier and relate our conversation to something many folks in our audience will be familiar with, and that's Who Shall Separate Us, the piece that you wrote for Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. That's a great example of the ways that secular and sacred can come together in a very unique moment. So I do want to ask you about that, because that's an incredible gift. You received this call to come to a meeting at Westminster Abbey. You're commissioned to write this piece for Queen Elizabeth's funeral, who is not yet deceased at this point. It's 2011, and they invite you to consider this text from Romans, who shall separate us from the love of Christ, a pericope that's really dear to her heart. Again, certainly an event that none of us will ever encounter, but brings together these audiences that we've been discussing. When you get this call, what is going through your mind? I mean, this is a very unique and perhaps a weighty experience. I'm curious what was going through your mind, but also does that change your process at all?
Well, when I got the call, I wasn't told what it was about. I was just asked to come to a meeting, a rather cloak and dagger meeting at Westminster Abbey, and it was the music staff of the Abbey who were there who presented this possibility. Would I write an anthem for the Queen's funeral? As you say, 2011, 11 years before she died. I was told that if I accepted, it would be this text, which is one of her favourite texts from Scripture. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? But I had not to tell anybody about it, to keep it a secret. There would be problems, trouble, if it got out that these things were being planned. But the thing is that there's a whole range of things being planned years before. All the obituary programmes were recorded years before she died. Even those, I mean, if anybody saw it on the television, those BBC angles were all very seriously rehearsed over a long, long time. It was like a work of art, actually, the different angles and so on. So everything was prepared for years in advance, including this. So I wrote the piece quickly, delivered it. The publishers got the music to the Abbey, and the music went straight into a drawer for the next 11 years. And produced again when she died, for the rehearsals to begin. I didn't actually attend the funeral. I was invited to, but my wife had broken her foot at the time, so I stayed behind. And in many ways, I'm glad I did, because London would have been a nightmare during that time. So I watched it on the television, along with 4 billion others, apparently, who watched the live broadcast of the Queen's funeral, and I had to pinch myself a bit when I was told that, because I don't think a composer has ever had a live audience of 4 billion for a new piece of music, and it won't happen again.
Well, and the chance to interview someone who has is quite a unique experience, and so I wanted to ask you about that, and I'll close with one last question here that relates to that experience, and something that I'm really sort of moved by in the way that you speak about your vocation, which is the art of surrender. And there's a very close relationship to the work that you do and the surrender that is required as it relates to spiritual life. And so just by way of an image, for any singer, tension leads to your demise. So any sort of manipulation or over-listening to yourself, it's pretty much the death of you. You have to experience it and feel it, and let it go. Mm-hmm. You write with pencil and paper, not necessarily piano, at the piano or with some composition software. I've heard you joke that the most technologically advanced you get is the electric pencil sharpener. And even in that process, you can't just hit backspace. Once it's on the page, you kind of commit to it, in a sense. So once that piece is written, at some point, you have to turn it into your publisher, or give it to the Queen. Mm-hmm. How do you know when it's time to let it go? And where do you find the courage to say, I've done the best I can, and put the pencil down? Just through practice over the years that one gets to that stage. When I was much younger, I was much more reticent about giving up or committing to the final decisions that I now make much more readily. When I was younger, I would have revised things a lot after hearing it, because you hear your mistakes. But you learn through your mistakes, so you make less mistakes as you get older. And so you develop a confidence and a
a sense of having lived the life of music much more, so that when you're a composer in your 60s, you're much more at ease about putting the double bar at the end of a piece and handing it over than one was when one was in my 20s.
And I suppose that's why we talk about practicing our faith. I guess throughout life we get better at those surrenders to God as well. Well, I know you're off to Benedictine College later this week to accept the prize for excellence in theology and the arts, and so we are just so gracious for your time this week, for being with us at Catholic, and certainly for making the time to be here with us for this interview this afternoon. If you would like to learn more about welcoming children in worship, I invite you to visit welcomingchildren.catholic.edu. And Sir James MacMillan, we appreciate you being with us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your visit on campus.
Thank you very much.